Interim Monday show time, because the show that was originally supposed to fill this time slot on the channel is not currently being made. Anyway, first one was on bourbon, and then I skipped a few weeks. The second one was on bonded whiskey. This one, rye whiskey, because it's seeing a resurgence in popularity, and I actually really like rye whiskey. I'm particularly a fan of rye whiskey from a certain Virginia distillery. But I figured I'd talk about what makes rye whiskey in the United States of America, and what sort of the basic premise of it is. So, to start off, the legal definition, I'm going to read this right off of the Cornell Law site because I can do that. Rye whiskey, or rye malt whiskey, is whiskey produced at not exceeding 160 degrees proof from a fermented mash of not less than 51% rye or malted rye grain, and stored at no more than 125 proof in charred new oak containers, and also includes such mixtures of whiskeys of the same type. Now, there's a little bit of bonus information. Whiskeys conforming to the standards described in paragraphs B1I and II of this section, which have been stored in the type of oak containers prescribed for a period of 2 years or more, may optionally be further designated as straight. For example, straight bourbon whiskey, straight corn whiskey, straight rye whiskey. And whiskey conforming to the standards prescribed in paragraph B1I of this section, except that it was produced from a fermented mash of less than 51% of any one type of grain and stored for a period of 2 years or more in charred new oak containers, may optionally be designated merely as straight whiskey. No other whiskeys may be designated straight. Straight whiskey includes mixtures of straight whiskeys of the same type produced in the same state. So, basically what that means is that in order to be rye whiskey, it's got to be at least 51% rye. It has to be aged in new charred oak casks or barrels. And there's some other stuff in there. Now, what are some examples of rye whiskey? Well, Jim Beam, of course, makes a rye whiskey. Their rye whiskey is sort of the most approachable modern, or an example of the approachable modern style of rye whiskey. I know I'm not getting any really good notes other than smells like rye whiskey, because this isn't how you get good notes. But it's, probably, I don't know for sure, probably pretty close to 51% rye. Because rye whiskey tends to have a character that is unappealing to a lot of people. I like it. I know a lot of people who like it, but generally in mass market, most of the rye whiskey sold is sold for the purposes of making rye cocktails. Now, then you've got craft brands like Filibuster, which is bottled in Bowertown, Virginia. Now, bottled, important to point out here, because it isn't distilled in Bowertown, Bowertown, Virginia. Just sounds like a Pennsylvania place name, I guess. It is distilled in Indiana, in a massive distillery that was once the Seagram's distillery, and the company that owns it is Midwest Grain Products. Colloquial, you know what I mean. It's also called MGP. Now, does that make it worse than, say, Catoctin Creek, which is distilled aged and bottled in Purcellville, Virginia? No, I don't like it as much, but that's not why. Now, it's still quite good whiskey. This is a slightly funkier rye than the Jim Beam, with a little bit more spice to it. See, one of the characteristics of rye whiskey is sort of a spicy funk that is sort of like if you've had rye bread. Take a big bite of rye bread and you get spice and a little bit of funk, and there's like some licorice and bitterness to it. And that's a major character of the whiskey, and a lot of people don't like that. I said I like rye whiskey. I've got I've got 8 bottles of rye whiskey right now. I know I say it every time, but I love that sound. This is Redemption Rye, which is bottled by the Redemption Barrel Selection Company, Lawrenceburg, Indiana. Now, Lawrenceburg, Indiana is where that big MGP facility is. And this is also MGP whiskey. Coincidentally, this is 95% rye. Who else was it that was bragging about their very old style 95% rye whiskey again? Bullet, that's who. Bullet. This is essentially the same. This is straight rye whiskey, so it's more than 2 years old. There is no age statement on it. But this is, in my personal opinion, very similar to Bullet Rye. Now, a long time ago, there were sort of like 2 schools of rye whiskey. One of which is misnamed, by the way. There was a Pennsylvania school, which is epitomized by Rittenhouse, by Overholt, and another that I can't think of, the Pennsylvania style, which was sweeter and smoother, but still with that rye funk and spicy punch. You know, and this, by the way, is sort of one of my go-to mixing rye whiskeys. The other style, which, like I said, is often, in my opinion, is misnamed, is the Maryland style rye, which is famously has its origins, according to legend, in the rye whiskey that George Washington made at his property in Mount Vernon. Where is that again? Virginia. That's where. But anyway, Catoctin Creek is sort of an example of that style. It's made, like I said, in Virginia, Purcellville, Virginia. And it is glorious, 100% rye. It is funky, sweet, all rye character, a little bit of floralness, some like citrus, and well, you should go buy a bottle of Catoctin Creek rye. It is damned good whiskey. And then you've got some interesting ones like this Old Forester rye, which is bottled at 100 proof, which is a good proof to bottle at. I know that it's on here somewhere. 65 rye, 20% malted barley, and 15% corn. Which means that the typical spice and funk of rye is met by the sort of gentle floral and bready notes of malted barley, and that sweetens it considerably and takes away some of the edge of that rye funk. And this is interesting, it's not my favorite rye whiskey. This has sort of turned into me just talking about the rye whiskeys that I have. Don't complain. And then there's James E. Pepper 1776 Rye, which is one of my least favorite ryes. I can't smell anything of it right now, but this is sort of the epitome of why some people dislike rye whiskey. This contains all of the sort of flavors that people point to when they say they don't like rye whiskey. And it amps them up and puts them at the forefront. Does that make it bad whiskey? No. I actually, I said it's my least favorite rye whiskey, and that's because it's got this overwhelming Sharpie note on it that I just can't get beyond. And it sort of kills the rest of the whiskey for me, because all I can smell is Sharpie. And that does not make for enjoyable sipping. But that's sort of like, there's, in the American style, there isn't a ton of variation that you can have in theory. But this is very different from this, which is very different from this. And it's enough difference to make the category interesting. For all that people say that, oh, bourbon all tastes the same, American rye whiskey all tastes the same, and okay. There are certainly some, like, boilerplate foundation flavors that are in all of them. But because everyone makes them to a slightly different style, to a slightly different specification, they all are a little bit different. Another thing to throw a wrench into the works is finishing. Famously, Angel's Envy finishes rye in port casks, and I think rum casks now too. I only have one finished rye whiskey, and it's a weird one. This. I will put a link to the review on like a card or something. But it broadens the possibilities of what you can do. And it broadens the style. I love that sound. And it changes what's possible. It expands it. And I wish more people would do it. And this has gotten a little bit off topic, so I will go ahead and end this video now. But I hope this has been a good primer on rye whiskey. And I hope that I haven't wasted too much of your time. Until next time, stay happy, stay geeks. Sláinte.